let's see if he, oh, there he is. There he is. All right. Here we go, John. All you do is answer that question I just sent you, and you should connect. Gosh, that took forever. There we are. It's connecting. All right, there we are, John.
All right, finally on board.
Hey, you know, it didn't take nearly as long as yesterday. Yesterday took forever, forever. So anyway, okay. Well, I was just telling people that the paintings behind me, the one on the bottom is an oil painting. Oh, the one on top, there we go, is watercolor. Oh, now it's going to slide. See if I can get this to stay. There we go. So we're going to get to the differences and why you think one or the other in just a minute. So let me start with the same questions I've been asking everybody each day. And the first one I always start with is, how did you become an artist? And tell us about your personal journey, whether you went to art school or if you were self-taught or what. So give us a little bit of background on your history.
Probably like most artists, I began very early as a child. I can't remember ever not drawing and painting of some nature. When I was 5 years old, in the Baptist church, you went from the nursery to big church, they called it. And because it was so utterly boring, sermons, and naturally would be a little squirming and things like that and making noises. And so my father, almost immediately when I started going to big church, as soon as the sermon started, he would reach in his pocket and hand me a sketch pad and a pencil and say, draw. And he knew I would be absorbed in that for the rest of the sermon. And fortunately for me, Southern Baptists tended to be long-winded, and so I got a lot of practice in church. But I was drawing all the time, and I'd go to school, and I think like other artists, the teacher would immediately see that, I couldn't read. I didn't learn to read for a long time because I had dyslexia, but I could draw, and I got recognition for that. And my grandmother was a painter. We lived in Mobile, and when I was 8, she had a colleague, two colleagues, John and Jane Shaw, who were very good painters in Mobile, and they taught a teenage art class on Saturday mornings from 8 to 12. And my grandmother talked them into allowing me to go to the arts class, and she paid the fees, bought all of my supplies and everything. And for the first year, when I was 8, the Shaws had me draw mostly set up still lifes, cow skull and stuff like that in charcoal, and also pastel. So for a year I worked in pastel and charcoal. And then when I was 9, they started me painting in oil. And oil has been the primary medium that I've painted in the rest of my life. Yeah. I'm very fortunate going to school. I had really good art teachers. When I was in high school in Meridian, Homer Castile was my art teacher. He was a very prominent Mississippi artist. He was a graduate of the Art Institute of Chicago, and he used to take me into his back room during class a lot of times and have everybody else doing some kind of work. And I would work with him on projects. He was doing a lot of book covers for publishers and stuff, and he would have me assist him in that. And then when I was in college at Mississippi College, I had a good teacher, Sam Gore, who is also he just passed away not long ago, very prominent Mississippi artist. And then, of course, in later years, I took quite a number of courses at the Art Students League of New York. And so, yes, I've had training all the way through. But like any artist, on your pilgrimage, you're learning as you work in various media. And that's about it.
Yeah. Well, I know Paul Fayard, when I talked to him on Monday, talked about Dr. Gore or Mr. Gore. I don't know if he, Professor Gore. And then, but you were also involved with the art colony in Mississippi, and I know that's been a real good experience for you, where it seems like you've mentioned it, and you go faithfully.
Yes, I when I was in Meridian, I was in the early 70s. Sandy and I and Will at the time, we called him William, he was about a year old, moved to Meridian. I became a minister, associate minister at First Baptist, and one of the things I did was teach art to teenagers and to adults there as part of my job activities. Mm-hmm. And I was very involved in the art scene, and one of the local artists was a man named Alec Loeb, who was very much involved in the Mississippi Art Colony, and he got me going to the colony. I attended for the first time in 1973. And at that time, I was by far the youngest person at the colony. The rest of them were old people in their 50s and 60s. Now I think there's only one other person at the colony now who's older than I am. So it's been these 40 plus years that have been very interesting.
Yeah, that's interesting. I learned the first time about Art Colony from Tina Lutz. They used to be over the museum here. And I have quite a few artists that I've known over the years that have gone there, and I've always had rave reviews about it. So obviously it's been a very influential program or event for a lot of Mississippi artists. And I think that's pretty neat. Yeah. Right. Okay, so you alluded to that you're mainly a oil painter, and of course this one right here above me is that watercolor. And that's kind of my favorite of your stuff, and I'm just a little partial.
Well, I still paint a lot in watercolor, and I have now. Actually, when I was in college, I painted primarily in oil. Though I did have one class, and basically Sam Gord didn't teach watercolor. He just had me go into a studio by myself, and have me do painting in watercolor. I didn't like very much being in a room all by myself. I preferred to be in a studio full of other people that we could all talk and everything. So I didn't make a lot of progress in watercolor in college. It was not until after college, actually in the early 70s in Meridian, when I started painting really heavily in watercolor. In fact, in between the years 1971 and 1974, 72 to 74, I painted 180 paintings, and I would say that over 100 of those were watercolor paintings.
Okay.
Most of my painting in those days was in watercolor. And today I probably paint about 20% of the time in watercolor. So,
yeah.
And there was a period in the early 80s when I painted exclusively in watercolor. I've done a lot of pastel and pen and ink and other kinds of media. I had a fling with acrylic in the early 70s when it first came out, and everybody said, "Oh, this is going to replace oil paint," but it didn't do it for me. So I couldn't do in acrylic what I thought I could do in oil.
Right.
And I really haven't painted in acrylic now probably in almost 20 years.
Right.
Back in the late 90s, early 2000s, occasionally if I had a show coming up and I needed some extra work, I would do a few acrylic paintings because they would dry very quickly and I could put them in the show. I didn't have to wait for them to dry.
Right.
But, I don't think I've done acrylics now in more than 15 years. Oil primarily, but also I like watercolor. In my studio, I have my left side of the room is set up for oil painting, and the right side of the room is set up for watercolor painting. And so I move back and forth between. Yeah. They're actually absolutely totally different media. You have a totally different mental approach. But for both of them, it's just like, as the cliche is, riding a bicycle. You know what you're doing when you start doing it, and you don't have to think about it. You just go right on through. But yeah. I do love watercolor, and I love oil. People always ask me in shows which I like best, and I do more oil, but it doesn't mean necessarily that I like oil better. I like watercolor also.
Yeah, well, I think for us as a gallery, we do sell more of the of the oil paintings. I mean, that's just because they don't have to worry about the glass. The watercolor pieces are going to be a bit heavier to hang on the wall. Not that it really matters, but I remember we've had conversations before when I first opened 10 years ago. Trying to sell anything under glass was just like an act of Congress. I mean, it was very difficult. And now things under glass are selling much better. Watercolors are really, I think, getting a resurgence in the retail environment. So that's been really nice to see that. And I just like the idea of having multiple mediums in the gallery so that people have options. And we usually always have at least one of your watercolors. We've got two right now, two different sizes. So FYI, in case anybody wants a watercolor from John, we got two going on right now.
Well, I've always, from when I first started painting in watercolor, I've always used the best in materials. The paper is 100% rag, they call it, which means cloth. It can never yellow. 100 years from now, that painting up there behind you, the whites will look just as white as they do right now. You can leave it out in the sun, and the whites would not turn yellow. Like the pulp paper has acid in it, and it turns yellow, like a newspaper left on the sidewalk turns yellow very quickly. But I've always used very expensive Darches paper, French-made paper, handmade. And I've always used Winsor & Newton, which are English-made watercolors. I think the best watercolors you can get. So I've never, taken any shortcuts in the materials that I use.
Yeah, because I know that you use the linen canvases and the I can't remember the brand name on the oil paints that you use, but you use high-end stuff, and people.
Oh, all the best. I use basically 3 different brands of oil paint because some brands I like the color better than others, but I do use some Winsor & Newton, Rembrandt, and Gamblin oil paint, and those are all 3 top drawer. And yes, I prefer painting on linen as opposed to cotton canvas.
Yeah. Well, I know that we have some small still lifes, and I'm thinking you may have used a canvas board on those.
It's not a canvas board. It's an art board. It's specifically made for painting. It's comparable to masonite, but it's not masonite. It doesn't have any acid in it or anything. And
I'll show those in a second.
I do like the boards for smaller pieces. I think primarily. Well, where I got into using boards, of course, the board is not nearly as wide as a stretched canvas. And I got into using boards about 15 years ago or so when I began traveling a lot to Italy. And I could carry, I couldn't carry a lot of canvases, but I could carry a bunch of boards all packed up together in a bag. And so I started using them for plein air painting first. Yeah. And then I like them. I like the board because it is smoother than canvas. Canvas has a tooth to it, and as a consequence, being smoother, one can paint. You might say a finer edge than you can with the. And there's certain little problems that you have to learn to deal with when you're painting on a very smooth surface, but I do like the board for smaller pieces, and I wouldn't mind using the board for large pieces, but that's a little bit impractical.
Yeah, I got you there. Well, let's talk a little bit about your imagery. People are familiar with the imagery with the older structures, the ones that are, look like they're about to maybe come down or whatever. I did hear a story recently, and I never knew this, why old barns are still up and even if they're kind of falling down, the farmers don't take them down. And I heard that it was always bad luck to take down a barn for a farmer. So they always let them fall and deteriorate themselves. But, the images that you've painted over the years, some of them may not be standing now. And I know you say that you take liberties sometimes on what you do, but tell us a little bit more about why you choose those and how you kind of process which ones you're going to.
Right. Well, in the course of my artistic career, I've painted a lot of things, and all of my work at the Art Students League was in figure painting, and painted a lot of portraits and other kinds of scenes and nautical type stuff, boats. But I've been drawn to old structures, houses, barn, outbuildings, since I was a small child. And when I was 5, my family lived in Mobile at the time, and when I was 5, we were making a trip north from Mobile to Marengo County, to Linden town, where my grandmother's sister, my great aunt Lizzie, lived. And I remember on that trip looking up at one point out of the car window, and there was a hill, and on top of the hill it was an old house. Really, it was just an old shack. It was wintertime, and smoke was coming out of the chimney, and I was arrested by that scene, and that template sort of stayed in my mind. And I would say that in most any of my paintings, more than 80% of any painting is just memory painting. I may have the structure may resemble some basic structure, but I make a lot of editing and changes in the structure itself, especially in the direction of the light and the shadows and all of that. And there's no doubt somewhat of a nostalgia in my mind of painting these older buildings. I've never been drawn to painting mobile homes and modern buildings and, stealing. But the older structures, and I ask myself, who lived there, and what do they do, and what are their stories, and I visualize it. I'm also a writer, and I do the same thing in writing. I try to, create things, trying to figure out who were these people and what were they doing, and these thoughts are always going through my mind when I'm painting one of these old structures.
Yeah. Well, I love them, and I think a lot of people do. So it's great. It's great memory triggers for people, whether it be old homestead or, grandparents, or just a structure that they used to pass every time on the way to grandparents' house, even if the grandparents' house didn't look like it. You always have this. It's a memory trigger for a lot of our customers, and they are very drawn to it for sure. Let's see. Tell us what's it like. And you might be in a different position in your career than maybe some of the younger artists we have, but how do you deal with your distractions of your family, whether it be your spouse, your children, your grandchildren, that you have some sweet grandchildren that I know are very special to you. So, how do you, balance your time of trying to, be serious about and disciplined about painting when you need to paint, and then setting aside time for them?
Well, I don't know that I've ever really. Well, I don't know that I've ever really found it a problem. I have, insofar as painting goes, my life is very structured in that I get up relatively early in the morning, and I write until breakfast time, and after breakfast I go to the studio and I paint. And that's usually starting around 7:30, and I work till about 11, and then I'm through for the day. That's all the painting I'm going to do the day. In the afternoon, I'm going to study my sermon, take a walk, and primarily read and do some other things. There's not a whole lot that interferes with one's life between 7:30 and 11 o'clock. And none of the grandchildren are playing sports or baseball games or having other things, and Sandy has got the things that she is involved in that time. So I really haven't had a real, you might say, distraction there.
Right.
I'm in the studio, and of course there are times when something may come up. We go out of town or something like that. But that's a planned breakaway type thing. So no, I think my daily routine from Monday to Friday is so rigidly, I guess some people might say, almost down, to the blocks of time when everything is done.
Right.
And like I say, I get up relatively early. I know a lot of people get up before I do, but generally speaking, I get up around 3 o'clock. And so I have a good stretch of full time, before breakfast, and then by the late afternoon, by 4:30, what I call pahana, which is Hawaiian for finished work. I'm all done for the day.
Yeah.
In fact, it's so structured. I write out my schedule every day of what I'm doing, and each of these segments, has a name, and I don't know why I do this, but my writing segment, I use the word grafo, which is Greek for writing, and for painting, it's pictoro e studio, painting and studio, and that's Italian. And then I use, for my reading time, lectio, which is Latin for I read. So I'm just a little weird.
No. Well, I didn't preface all our conversation with, in case people didn't know, you are a semi-retired pastor. You were my pastor when you first came to Tupelo, and I'm not sure how long that's been. It feels like I've known you for quite a long time. I was very, very young.
More than 40 years ago.
40 years ago. Yeah. And so, you have your PhD in theology, correct?
Right.
Yeah. And so you do have, I think that that language, let me see if I can kind of put my thoughts to words here. You as an artist, and I think the master artists were, they weren't just love of art, they were love of the language and love of literature and love of multiple levels of things. And I think you were very similar to that because of your knowledge of the language and of literature and the arts. I just think you can see it on the canvas and how you approach it, how you handle the light and the depth of pieces. And it's just, to me, it just adds so much more to the story. And I think it's just so interesting, so interesting.
Well, I've never really just worn one hat, as you say. Now, we're talking in terms of me being an artist, a painter, but also I am still a pastor, preach every Sunday, except now that we've gone into this hibernation time, I've been preaching on Facebook. But
well, I'll have to log in and see it then.
Yeah. And so I've been giving little short sermons on Facebook each Sunday for the last 4 weeks. Yeah. And I also have been very active as a writer and have been doing that, for many, many decades, actually. Right. There's just a lot of things in life that I like to do, like a lot of other people. So I've never been really content just to
do one thing.
Stay with one thing.
Yeah. Well,
I'm a jack of all trades, master of none.
Yeah. Well, my last question, I guess I kind of already jumped to it, and we've kind of discussed it, was, why do you paint and why not another career? But really, your career has been multi-layered for your whole career.
My adult life.
Yeah. You were a pastor.
I became a pastor at 21.
Yeah.
I was a painter at that time, and I was doing a lot of writing at that time. And
just different things were in the forefront at different times, I guess.
Exactly. Yeah. And there were times when one interest would have so many demands upon me that the others had to take a back seat. But overall, the life I live now is, to me, the best of all worlds, because I'm able to give the emphasis to each one that I feel I need to give, and keep all things going at the same